1. Into the woods, a terrifying encounter. Sarah had been driving for hours, the open road stretching endlessly before her as she made her way out of town. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, her car sputtered to a stop in the middle of nowhere, the fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. Heart pounding, Sarah stepped out of the car and surveyed her surroundings. She was surrounded by dense woods, the trees looming ominously overhead. Panic began to rise within her as she realized just how isolated she was. With no other option, Sarah began to walk, hoping to find help before the darkness descended completely. But as she made her way deeper into the woods, a sense of unease settled over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And then she saw him. A man standing among the trees, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She called out to him, but he remained silent, his gaze unyielding. Terrified, Sarah turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled through the underbrush. She fumbled for her phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal out here in the wilderness. As she ran, branches tore at her clothes and thorns dug into her skin, but she pushed on, driven by fear and adrenaline. She could hear the man's footsteps behind her, closing in with each passing moment. Finally, just when she thought she couldn't run any longer, Sarah burst into a clearing and stumbled upon a dirt road. In the distance, she could see the lights of a passing car, and she waved frantically, praying that they would stop. Moments later, a car screeched to a halt beside her, and a kind stranger pulled her inside, asking what had happened. Gasping for breath, Sarah told him about the man in the woods, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The stranger nodded gravely and drove her to safety, reassuring her that she was out of harm's way. But even as she sat trembling in the passenger seat, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped a fate far worse than she could have imagined. Now, as she recounts her harrowing ordeal to the authorities, Sarah knows that she will never forget the terror of that night in the woods and the silent man who watched her from the shadows. 2. Nightfalls Hunt, a family's terrifying encounter. The Smith family's journey to the countryside started out like any other weekend getaway. They piled into their car, excitement bubbling in their veins as they left the city behind and ventured into the unknown. But as night fell and the miles stretched on, their joy turned to apprehension when the fuel gauge dipped dangerously low and the car came to an abrupt stop on a deserted road. With a heavy heart, Mr. Smith stepped out into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through the thick veil of night as he disappeared into the woods in search of a gas station. Left behind in the car, Mrs. Smith and the children huddled together, their nerves fraying with each passing moment. It was then that they heard the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs, a sound that sent a shiver down their spines. Peering out into the darkness, the children's eyes widened in horror as they caught sight of a group of shadowy figures emerging from the depths of the forest. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they watched in silence, their breath catching in their throats as the group closed in on a lone man, his desperate cries echoing through the night. In the flickering light of the moon, the children could see the glint of sharp teeth and the hungry gleam in the hunter's eyes. With a sinking feeling in the pit of their stomachs, the children realized the true horror of their situation. They were witnessing a hunt, a primal ritual of survival turned twisted and savage. As the man's screams pierced the night, they huddled closer together, trembling with fear and disbelief. In a desperate bid to escape the nightmare unfolding before them, Mrs. Smith turned off the car's lights, plunging them into darkness in the hopes of remaining unnoticed. But their tears of terror betrayed them, their sobs echoing in the night as they prayed for their father's swift return. Finally, just when they thought they couldn't bear it any longer, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel signaled Mr. Smith's return. With a wild look in his eyes, he urged them to flee, his hands trembling as he slammed the car into gear and peeled away from the scene. As they sped through the night, the children clung to each other, their hearts still racing with fear. And as they shared their harrowing tale with others in the days to come, they knew that they would never forget the darkness they had encountered in the heart of the countryside, a darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the unknown. 3. Dark Road, a tale of survival. The night had been filled with laughter and adventure as the group of teenage women embarked on a road trip, the thrill of the open road stretching out before them. But as the darkness descended and the fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, their excitement turned to fear. With a sinking feeling in the pit of their stomachs, the women found themselves stranded on a deserted road. The only sound, the distant hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Panic gripped them as they realized just how vulnerable they were, alone in the darkness with no one to turn to for help. Their fears were soon realized when a group of drunken men stumbled out of the shadows, their leering eyes filled with malice as they approached the car. With a sinking feeling in their hearts, the women knew that they were in danger, that these men meant them harm. In a desperate bid to escape, they locked the car doors and rolled up the windows. But the men were undeterred, pounding on the doors and windows with drunken rage. Tears filled their eyes as they huddled together in fear, praying for someone to come to their rescue. With each passing moment, the men grew more aggressive, their shouts filling the night air with menace. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the women's prayers were answered. A passing car slowed to a stop and a kind stranger emerged, chasing off the drunken assailants and offering the women a ride to safety. As they sped away from the scene, the women clung to each other, their hearts still pounding with fear. And as they recounted their harrowing ordeal to the authorities, they knew that they would never forget the terror of that night, a night that had turned their carefree adventure into a fight for survival.